All right, well, welcome back. This is still Introduction to Programming Using Python. Susan Ibach, Christopher Harrison, and we left off doing loops. And
Yes.
when we were doing our loops, based on numbers, which is a great way to learn loops. And you will certainly be doing it based on X numbers. You will absolutely be dealing with numbers. But I would argue more commonly, you're going to have a collection of items that you need to do something to each item. So wouldn't it be nice if maybe I could, create some form of a container that would allow me to have multiple items and say, a list?
Don't stop still. You keep trying to jump ahead on my slides here. Let me go.
All right.
All right.
Susan, go.
Awesome. So we have been talking about loops, and loops are great for going through doing things multiple times, but they also could be great for looking at multiple values. And so we want to talk a little bit about the idea of lists, because there are times when we talk about our problem solving again, where one of the problems we have to solve is to remember a list of values. And this happens in the real world, day to day. You want to maybe remember the names of everybody who's coming to a party. Because you have to print out their name cards later, or you have to make sure you remember if anybody's a vegetarian or needs kosher food. You need to make sure you have enough glasses and plates for everyone. So a lot of times you need that sort of remember everybody who's coming. You might need to remember all the scores you got in the different courses that you're taking, because you need to calculate your GPA. Maybe you need to remember the directions to get somewhere. You want to, so many of these tools now, there's all these map applications that'll tell you turn by turn directions, but I need to remember, go down this street, turn right, then turn left or go north on this street for 1 kilometer. I am a Canadian, I did go with kilometers, then turn right, and so on. So there's a lot of situations where we're given what effectively works out to be a list of different values. So it's important when we start problem solving with code that we have an ability to work with those lists and to remember those different lists. So a list is the object in programming that allows you to store multiple values. The directions, the names of your guests, what you need to buy at the grocery store, whatever it is. So to declare a list, the syntax is fairly straightforward.
I love the sample names.
Yeah, you like the names? I'm planning for, this is my guest list for the party.
Oh.
So Christopher, good news, you're invited.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're invited to the party, and I'm hopefully invited to my own party. And I've decided that Bill and Satya can join us as well.
Okay, well, that's awful nice of you.
I thought that would round out the group of four. Maybe this is our little golfing foursome.
There we go.
It'll be you, me, Bill, and Satya going out for a little round of golf. By the way, I'm a terrible golfer, so my sympathy.
That's okay. My handicap is my swing.
Okay. So I can create a list, and this is literally going to store all those different names inside the variable guess. So the syntax is a little bit different when we declare a list. If you take a look at the code, you can see we have square brackets indicating the start and end of a list, and we have commas separating the different list values. So that's just the syntax you have to use, and you're welcome to store different data types in the list. You can store numbers, or you can store strings, or you can store dates. It's really up to you. Python will allow you to put different data types in a single list. So you could store a name, a number, and a data type, and a date all in one list. But I don't recommend that, because it's very hard later when you're trying to go through the values in the list to go, wait, is the first value a date and the next one's a string and the next one's a number? If you're storing, for example, the names of all your guests and the ages of all your guests,
right,
I would actually recommend you have two lists. One with the names, one with the ages. That's going to be a lot easier for you to work with than having a list of name, age, name, age, name, age, name, age.
Yeah, you don't want to have to remember where you are in each one of those.
And even if it's, so anything where you want to store different values, you're probably better off having lists for each value than mixing it. Even if it's name and the city where they live. They're all strings. I could theoretically store that all in one big long list. You know, Susan, Ottawa, Christopher, Seattle, Bill, Seattle, Satya, Seattle. Apparently everybody's in Seattle.
Move to Seattle.
Yeah. No, thank you. But it would be better to have a name of guests list and a home of guest list. And I know that the first value in the names goes with the first value in the list of cities. And the second value in names goes to the second value in cities. And I know the third value in names goes with the third value in cities. So that's just in generally speaking, when we're working with lists and code, we generally store one piece of information.
Yeah.
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 We store all names in
Yep.
one list, all cities in one list, all favorite sports in another list.
Sure. And again, there's always multiple ways to solve that. So you can, kind of get a bit more complex and maybe creating more complex data types and things like that. So there's a lot of ways that you can handle that. But keeping things simple, especially for where we are, try to keep one data type inside of a list.
And you said, not even one data type, one piece of information.
Yeah.
You have multiple names, but they're all names of the people coming.
Yeah.
Said, if you're storing their cities, you're going to make a separate list for that. So that's just a tip that'll make your life easier when you start working more with lists. So we go back to the slides for a second here. In terms of syntax, sometimes we were talking last chapter about one of the things we often do with loops is things like reading from files or reading from databases. So what we might do is initially we create an empty list, and then we end up with a loop that goes and reads values from a file, which, hey, guess what modules we're doing this afternoon? We're going to be reading from a file. So you're actually going to start putting everything together here, and you'll be able to write loops that read from files, put the values in a list. We're going to get to that by the end of the day. So to create an empty list, the syntax is simply give your list a name, and then you just specify the square brackets with nothing in them, and that literally is an empty list. Once you have created a list and you've given it values, it's important to know, how do I ask for a specific value? Because having a list of values is great, but if my program is going to print out a guest list for me, then I'm probably going to need a loop that says, go get the first value, print it, go get the second value, print it, or take the first value, write it to a file, take the second value, write it to a file so I can send it to someone else. So the way we do that is we have to specify where in the list of values located. And remember, how do we count in programming?
Counting starts with 0.
Counting starts with 0. That's right. So, Christopher, you're guest 0.
I'm 0.
You are 0.
Wow.
Hey, guess what? I'm number 1.
Okay.
Bill's number 2 and Satch's number 3. So
this doesn't resemble the org chart in any way, shape, or form, by the way.
Not at all. Absolutely not. But in terms of their positions, if you look at the slide, you can see it said the reference, if I reference the value in index position 0 or in position 0, that's going to be Christopher. If I specified guest 1, that would be Susan. Guest 2 would be Bill. Guest 3 would be Satcha. So you can, at any time you need to, it's possible to say, give me that specific value. In this case, if I say, give me score 3, that's going to return what value, Christopher?
0, 1, 2.
Yeah, 0, 1, 2.
62.
3. So therefore,
49.
yes.
Okay.
It will return
Sorry.
49.
Yep,
Yeah.
you're right.
I was waiting for you to catch up there.
0.
Okay, we'll practice counting later.
I need to take off my shoes.
We didn't get past 5, but so anyway, so because it's score number 3, because we start counting from 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, the value in the list that's in position 3 is in fact the number 49, even though that's the 4th value in the list. Remember, counting from 0. One of those little things we have to keep remembering. So sure enough, yes, this would print out Christopher and 49 on the screen. We call the position in terms of, in geek speak, when we talk about a position of an item in a list, we refer to that as the index. So you'll hear us say, what's the index of that item? What's the position index? So that's just a term we use when we're referring to a location of an item inside a list, or sometimes called an array. One of the neat things I like about Python is it actually allows you to count backwards. This is kind of neat. So if you want the last value in the list, that's position -1. The second to last value in the list is -2. Third to last is -3. And in this case, because there's 4 entries, Christopher would be -4.
I just seem to be the smallest number.
Don't take it personally. So you can literally say, print the value in the list that's in position -1. And that is actually something where there are times where you might want the last value.
Yep.
So it's nice to just be able to say, hey, get me the value in position -1. Rather than, there are other ways to do this. You can ask for what's the size of the array and then say, get me the one that's at the highest row. But it's just really nice not to have to do that. Just say, just give me the last value.
Yep.
The one in position -1.
Yeah.
I can't honestly think of a scenario, a business situation, where I would find myself asking for the third from the last. It's a little weird.
No, but it is quite frequent. I just need that last item. Sometimes the second to last, but the biggest one is that last item. So having that kind of neat little shortcut of just -1 works really well. And actually, a couple of people asked that in the chat window. So that was like perfect timing. Just saw the question, and then sure enough, Susan's doing her demos.
There we go. Awesome. You've put the right information on the slides when someone asks the question, and it also tells me that you guys are already getting it and already thinking about, wait, I want to do this. How do I do that? So that also tells me you're already thinking about real world problems you want to solve.
Yep.
It's really nice to have that ability to count backwards.
Yeah, and somebody actually asked, so counting backwards, there's no 0. No, 0 is the starting point for going forwards. -1 is the starting point for going backwards.
Yeah. So a little inconsistent maybe, but the thing is, if you specified
how
do you say -0 exactly? If you specified -0, well, that would still be 0, and then that would be the first value, not the last value.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes sense if you think about it.
Square root of -1.
Yeah. So let's go into some code and let's actually create a little list. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to create my guest list. And just to make you feel better, Christopher, look, I'll list myself first. I can be in position 1 or 0, and you can be number 1.
I liked, however, though, that you still said, I like two things that you did there. I like the fact that you still said 1 for yourself, and I also like the RE on Christopher, very Canadian again.
Yeah. Isn't that how you spell your name? Or you would think it was Christophe. Would you like me to turn you to Christophe?
Yes, there we go.
That's changes your name completely.
Yes.
No, your name is Christopher. I will enter it as Christopher.
Thank you.
And now I have that list. Obviously, I can print a value. Now, when you're specifying a position, one of the things you want to do is you will specify, you use the square brackets. So if I say guess 0, that will be the first value in the list.
Yep.
And if I want the second value in the list,
don't forget your parentheses on print.
1. Yes. Oh, yes, I do need, that's right. I need by parentheses around the print statement as well. Hey, as I promised, we would make a few mistakes in our code along the way.
And then go ahead and maximize your Visual Studio there. Make it.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Dun, dun, dun. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. And now when I run, you can see that we get back Susan and Christopher back from the list because position 0 was Susan, position 1 was Christopher, so they both come back.
Perfect.
So fairly straightforward, nice and easy to create it and go through and create that list.
I like it.
All right, now once you have a list, one of the other things you're going to do is maybe you're getting a list of values from a file or a database, and then you have to update that list and send it back. Maybe that's what your program is there to do. Maybe you're getting a list of guests, and then your program is going to vet them and decide, do I really want this person at my party?
I'm hosed, aren't I?
So, but in all seriousness, there are definitely situations where you'll get a list of values, and the purpose of your program is to work through that list of values. I'll give you an example. I used to do a lot of programs which worked with addresses. So I might get a list, and I don't know if you know this, but the big companies get a discount on mailing things out if they specify the address in a very specific format. And so maybe my program is one that's written for a big bank or something that's mails out bank statements to everybody, all of their customers, and they want to make sure they get the discounted rate from the post office because that's going to save them a lot of money. But to do that, they have to always display the addresses in a very precise format. So maybe your program is taking the address the way the user entered it and standardizing it. So it's making sure that the state or the province name is using the appropriate abbreviation, is saying, if you enter WA dot, we're going to remove the period off the end. We don't put that in a standardized address. So maybe that's what your program does.
And there's also going to be a lot of times when maybe you're actually starting with nothing, and that what you're going to be doing again is kind of reading in from a file, reading in from a database, reading user input. So I have nothing to start. I need to go read the data in, and again, I don't know what's going to be, how many items are going to be there, what's going to be there, but I just know I need to go collect my data, and then let's go back and start processing it. So that ability to manipulate and manage that list is going to be imperative. I've got to have it.
I have to be able to add new values when I need to. I need to be able to update the values that are already in there, and there's other business situations where I do want to actually remove people from the list that said, I'm sorry, Christopher.
I know.
I'm not sure you're getting to come to the party.
I'm hosed.
So to update a value in a list, it's actually pretty straightforward. How do you update a variable? Well, you would just say variable name equals a new value. Well, if you take a look at the code here on the slide, if I want to change the value of inside a list, you specify the list name, but you have to specify the index position. Which value in the list do you want to change? So I'm changing, and I'm sorry, Christopher, I apologize. What I'm doing now is I'm saying Steve is invited, and so basically what's going to happen is the value in position 0 is now going to be, and I'm just going to take a slightly better pen here. There we go. I'm sorry, it's now apparently Steve who's coming to the party instead of Christopher.
I'm just going to sit over here and cry.
I promise you'll be invited to the next one.
All right.
So this basically updates that first value from Christopher to Steve. And you can see the way the output, when I print out the value of row 0 or position 0 in the list, it now shows Steve instead of Christopher.
Yep.
You can add values to a list as well, also very useful, using the append function. So if I use the append function, I'm going to go back to my highlighter. I do an append to so I specify my list name. I call the append function, and then I specify the value I want to add. New values will always be added to the end of the list. So if I have 4 values, this is going to become the 5th value. If I have 10 values, it'll become the 11th value. So you don't have to say, add if I have 10 rows in my array, put this in position 11. The nice thing is you just say, here's another value, put it on my list, and add it to the end. So if you look at the code, if I want to confirm that the value was added correctly, I can just use that little last value trick. Use that little -1 to say, hey, after I append it, let's look at the last value that I just appended. And sure enough, that's going to return Steve because that is now the last value in my list.
So it's dynamic. It automatically stays up to date.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have to
I like
worry
that
about
you're
it.
just explicitly removing me.
Yes, in this next example, I'm sorry, it's just plain.
Wow.
So in this case, you can also remove a value
Not
from a
even
list.
being subtle about it. Just boom, you're gone.
So I can remove a value from a list as well. There's actually 2 different ways to remove a value from a list. If we take a look at the code on the slide, one option is to use the remove function. With the remove function, you specify the value contained in the list that you want to remove. So I'm not specifying the index position this time. This time I'm actually saying I'm explicit, as you said, my apologies, Christopher, this time. I know you were double booked this evening and you won't be able to make it, so I'm removing Christopher from the guest list. So now if we do this, if we then say, well, what's the first value in the list now? What value is going to be in position 0? It's going to be Susan because Christopher is removed. It doesn't leave an empty list item. It actually removes that entry from the list. So now the first item in the list will be Susan. So it's not leaving a blank behind. It's actually removing that value from the list completely.
Okay.
The other way of doing it is the delete command because sometimes you're going to want to say, I want to remove Christopher, I want to remove Bill, I want to remove Susan. Other times you're going to want to say remove row or value, the first value, remove the 8th value, remove the first value. So the delete command, now it's a little weird because this one is, the syntax is different. It's not guest.delete. It's actually a delete command, so a little confusing. You know what, you'll probably forget which it is and have to go look it up because you won't remember. But the nice thing about the delete command is it allows you to specify the index position of the value you want to remove from the list.
Okay.
So you can do it either way. If you know the list position, specify that. If you know the name or the value you want to remove, you can specify that with the .remove. So your choice. But both of them do the same thing. They both remove a value completely from the list. They don't leave a blank or a placeholder in there. So if you had 4 values in the list, after you remove a value, you only have 3 values left in that list. So let's actually play around with that. Let's go over to Visual Studio, and we've got our list here. So let's go ahead and let's add, who should we invite to our party? Christopher, got any suggestions?
Colin.
Let's invite Colin. All right, we're going to invite Colin to our,
Parentheses.
oh, oh yes, add, yes.
Yeah.
Let's add, I'm going to add the value Colin.
That is one of the things that's probably
Gonna drive you nuts.
trickiest to get used to is when to use parentheses, square brackets, and so forth. And one thing that I always recommend to people that are getting into development is, be particular about your vocabulary, about how you call things. That you'll notice that I never interchange things like parentheses, so that's your parentheses, your square brackets, so square brackets, and then your curly braces. I always call them those exact same things because regardless of the language that you're talking about, they always mean very different things. And so if you're using the same terms over and over and over again, so if I'm just calling everything parentheses, all that you're going to wind up doing is confusing other people and probably also confusing yourself as well. So kind of keep an eye on that as you're getting into development.
Yes, yeah, because there are some situations where you use curly braces, some situations where you use square brackets, like in lists. When I specify an index position or the values for a list, I use square brackets. When I'm calling functions and methods, I put the parameters I'm passing to those functions and methods inside parentheses.
Yep.
Or braces, some people just call them. Or, there's so many different names for it all.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, so if we go back to Visual Studio, you can see what I've done. I've invited Sonal to the party as well because he's helping us out with the Q&A today.
Hey, Sonal.
And he actually created a couple of the slide decks for this course, so definitely deserves to get invited. This will be our post-MPA celebration. And now when I go off and I run this code, you can see I've used the add method to add the values. And if I ask for the last value, was it not add? It was append. Oh, see, I already messed up.
And actually, while you're fixing that, I would mention real quick, because I'm looking at it and I didn't catch it either. That's in .NET when you're working with a list, it's add.
I know, yeah. It's just, one language. The more coding you do, the more confused you get between languages. Okay, so let's go back to the code and see if it works now. I've changed the .add to a .append. And now we go off, and sure enough, we can see that the last value in the list is now Sonal. So it must have successfully added our values to the list. Now, what would be really nice would be to have maybe a loop that showed everyone in the list. We'll get there.
Yep.
We will get there.
By the way, a couple of people have, actually several people have asked, do this real quick for me.
Sure.
And because the best way to do it is, you know what, let's do it this way.
What's the question, Christopher?
The question is, if I say remove and there was multiple items in there with the same name,
sure.
What would it do?
Well, then I'm at append. The next one I do is an update, then we'll do remove, and we'll get right into that.
Okay, perfect.
So let's try, let's do a guest dot, let's change a value. If we want to change a value, and we decide that that Bill isn't going to be invited anymore. We're going to now change that. Actually, what I've decided is Sonal is now going to be our third guest. And so we're adding Colin to our guest list.
Okay.
And we've decided that, I'm sorry, Bill, Sonal's coming instead of you.
Wow, that's...
Yeah. He's a busy guy. It's hard to get him. And he's often not available. So this is a way of updating. So this is update a value. And this append method is used to add a value. So we'll try that out. And sure enough, obviously the last guest is now Colin because he was added to the end of a list. Let me just print out the value of guest number 3 to prove that that is now, in fact, Sonal.
And while you're doing that, it's also worth highlighting real quickly that while you were doing this, you could have just as easily have used input rather than just hard coding it in.
Sure.
It's one of those things when you're doing a simple demo like this, that if you throw in that input, that's now just another step to go in and do the demos. Yeah. And that's why we're just hard coding it in. But could you use input or anywhere else that you could be reading a string from? Absolutely 100%. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be hard coded. It's just easier to demo.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're just trying to keep the code as easy to read as possible.
Yep.
So if we look at the code now, you can see we've appended the value, and then I'm just printing the new value, and then updating a value and printing it. So you can see that the updates happen in the code. So you can see the new values that have been updated in the list. And that takes us to delete, or the remove. So if I was to remove someone, so let's have, we're going to invite Bill twice. So we actually have the same value in there twice. And actually, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm curious. Let's find out. Was it .remove? Yes. Oh, thank you, IntelliSense. Yeah. There we go, helping me remember that it is remove. And let's going to remove Bill from the list. And then I'm just going to comment out these 2 lines, because then I'm going to ask for the last value.
Okay.
Because if I ask for the last value, if it removed both the Bills, then the last value should be Christopher.
Yep.
If, however, it removed only one Bill, then the last value will still be Bill. So that's going to be my little... I'm just going to comment out this code, and then we'll see what is the last value in the list. Keep forgetting no dope. Yes, I know. I keep forgetting that. Last value.
And again, while you're typing this out, if you're ever curious about, what's going to happen, the easiest way to figure it out is just write a little bit of code and just test it real quick.
Try it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I remember, and I know you've done this as well, when you're in the classroom, you know, somebody asks something that you don't know, because we don't know everything. We'll openly admit that. You know, somebody asks a question, hey, let's go in and try it. Give it a shot. So go ahead.
In fact, there's been a couple of questions in the Q&A where I said, I don't know what would happen, try it. I've actually answered that in the Q&A.
Yep.
So let's find out if we specify a value that exists multiple times, it only removes the first one it finds. So if you search for a value, if there's multiple occurrences of that value in the list, it will only remove the first one.
Correct.
So now we know what happens. And of course, if you specify a name that only appears once, then, well, I can't really prove that by printing the last value. It will only remove that specific value. And we can also use delete to remove a specific one. And we can say delete a particular entry from the list. So I could remove my name from the list. And then if I print the first value in the list, it should now be, don't
forget your parentheses.
Yeah, I'll get there. And that would be, let's say, print who is guest 0. So let's try, this was one option. Actually, let's not remove that. Let's remove.
Yeah, leave me.
I'm going to take off Satya off the end there. Satya. All right, so we remove Satya and we delete the first row. So now the first row should be Susan and the last row should be Bill.
Close print.
Okay, close parentheses. Thank you. All right, so I'm just going to move this code up a bit so it's a little easier. By the way, this is one of my favorite little keyboard shortcuts. If you highlight some code inside Visual Studio and you hold down the Alt key and the up-down arrow, it just moves the code up and down. So instead of always going copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste, sometimes if you're just moving code, it's a handy little trick. Alt up arrow, Alt down arrow. So now I run, and because I removed Satya from the end of a list, that means the last value in the list is now Bill. And because I said delete the guest in position 0, that's Susan, the first guest in the list is now Christopher.
There you have it.
Okay, so I can now update a value in a list. I can now remove a value from the list, and I can now add a value from the list. The next thing really is the ability to start moving around through the list. It'd be nice to see, how do I go through all those values? How do we combine what we learned about loops with these lists? So I can say, well, just show me everyone in the list, because that comes up quite frequently. Oh, and actually, I forgot one last thing I want to show you, which is also how to search a list, which can be useful as well. So if you take a look at the slide here, there is also an index function you can use. And if you call the index function, what it will do is it is actually a function of your list. You pass it the value you want to search for, and it will return you the first one it locates. So if you had 2 Bills in this case, it would tell you the location of the first one it locates. And it'll return the index. So in this case, if I ran this code, Christopher's in position 0, Susan's in position 1, Bill in position 2, Satya in position 3. So when I say go find Bill, it's going to come back and it's going to return a 2.
Yep.
Because that's the index position of Bill's entry in the list.
So a couple of real quick things that I want to highlight just from the chat window that's been coming up. People are really into the remove. And so one of the questions was which item is removed if there's multiple. So if there's 2 Bills in there and I say
first one
Bill,
would be removed.
Exactly, yeah. It's going to be the first one. Yep. And then the second thing that a lot of people have been asking is, how about a wild card remove? So could I just simply say Bill or B asterisk and have it remove everybody? And the short answer to that question is no, that there's no like wild card or anything like that. However, one of the things that you could do is kind of combine different things that we've already done.
You can get creative.
You could have done that with a loop. So you could just simply say, go in, find all the Bills or find all the Susans. See, I'm going to remove you from the party this time. Go in and find all the ones that you want and remove them one at a time. So you could loop through it if you wanted to get rid of everybody, but at least out of the box there isn't anything. But that's one of those that you could easily do. It's not that
you know what?
challenging.
That is a problem for you.
There you go.
So now you get to ask yourself, okay, if that function won't do it, how could you, once we've learned how to do loops, ask yourself, how could I write a loop that remove everybody that had that name from a list? So there's an extra challenge for you to try at the end of the module, because I'm sure by the time we're in this chapter, you guys are capable of solving that by writing a loop that goes through everything and says, everybody named Bill, remove them. You could do it. And for the wildcard, you could use some of those string functions we learned. There's string functions that allow you to say, take only the first character. So you could use a string function that says, take only the first character of a name. And if the first character of a name starts with a B, remove them from the list. So you could use string functions in a for loop to get your wildcard functionality. Does this feature do it? No. .index doesn't do it. .remove doesn't do it. But you could write your own logic to solve those types of problems.
Exactly. Yep.
Awesome. So said we can also search a list. I'll do that in a second when we're playing around. I do want to point out, though, if you do a search for a value that doesn't exist in the list, you will, in fact, it can't really return, a lot of programs would return a 0 or a -1 if it didn't find a value in the list. That's sort of a convention used in a lot of other programming languages. But we have a little problem here. Because if I tell you that I couldn't find it and I say it's in position 0, well, hang on. Position 0 is Christopher.
Yep.
And if I returned a -1 as a way of trying to say, oh, it's not in the list, so I'll return -1. Well, if I say, get me the value in position -1, well, that's the last value of the list. That's Satcha. So in Python, unlike a lot of other programming languages, which would return a 0 or a -1 or something if it couldn't find a value in a list, you actually get an error. And your code's going to go spewing and spitting nasty messages all over the screen if you search for a value but it can't find in the list, which is why the error handling chapter we're going to cover later today is really important. Okay, back to the slides. The last thing I want to do is I want to talk about how we go through that loop. How do we use a loop to process all the values in the list? So now we're taking what we learned before and applying it to our lists. The easiest way, let's start with a for loop, because we're comfortable with the basic for loop. You know how to declare a for loop. You say for, we create a variable. I'm calling it steps. You know that's my favorite name for that variable. And this loop is going to execute 4 times, because I happen to know, right now, I know there's exactly 4 values in the list. So then, as I go through the loop, I can say print out from the guest list the one in index position of steps, because the first time through the loop, that's going to be 0. So it'll print out Christopher. Second time through the loop, it'll be 1. That'll print out Susan. Third time through the loop, it'll be 2. It'll print Bill. Third time through the loop, it'll be value 3. That'll print out Satcha. And remember, in for loops, it never actually reaches that higher number. It executes 4 times, but it counts 0, 1, 2, 3.
Right.
So that will print out each of the values. So let's just go see that in action. And I'm just going to do a little Control-KC, comment that out. Remove a value from the list, just so I can remember what all that code was when later on, if you're looking at it, you'll remember what it all was. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a loop that says for steps in a range of 4. So go through 4 values, and each time you go through the loop, I would like to print out from my list of guests the value in index position steps. Now, I'm going to try and put a breakpoint on here so we can sort of step through it. You can see how it works. So when I execute, the first time I run in, I'm right here, and it's executing my code. So it's just entered my for loop. You can tell by the little yellow arrow there. You can tell, oh, I haven't run Zoom it yet. My apologies. Let's do this then. So by the yellow arrow is indicating the next line of code is going to execute. So right now, if I hover over the variable steps, really neat feature in Visual Studio when you're running the debugger, because I put a breakpoint here, it stopped when it got to this line of code. And if I hover over the variable steps, it tells me the current value of steps is 0. And if you want to get really fancy, I can actually pin that so that little window stays over there so I can see the value of steps as we're chugging along. And
Visual Studio is so cool.
If I hover over the variable guests, I can see that the current value of the list guests is Susan, Christopher, Bill, and Satcha. Let me pin that over there as well so we can kind of keep track of that as we're chugging along.
Nice.
Now I'm going to step through my code. There's a little step into F11 or the step into button in the toolbar. And now it prints the first value and says, okay, let's go to the next value. So now you can see it sets steps to 1. And then prints that value and then steps to 2. And then you can see the value of steps going through and the output appearing on the screen. But you can actually see it as it's going inside the debugger and the output appearing.
I like it. Okay.
All right. So we've got the ability to loop through all the values in our list. If I take out the breakpoint just to have you see it running more quickly, no, take off the breakpoints, thank you. And I just run that, you'll just see, boom, there's my 4 values printed from the list.
Yep. Awesome.
But I don't know about you, Christopher, but I do see one little problem in that code. I'm saying execute the loop 4 times.
And actually, somebody called that out in the chat window, like, wouldn't it be better to? And they threw out one possible. And
what did they? I want to know. What did they suggest?
They called out pulling up the length of the array.
I love it, and that is
Okay.
exactly what I would like to do.
Okay.
Is I don't know how many values are typically going to be in an array, or in the list. So one of the things I can do is there is a function that allows me to find out how many values are in the list, and then I can say execute the loop as many times as there are values in the list, and that's done using the length function. So fantastic job by someone in the chat window there, because guess what? If you don't know how many values are in the list, if you take a look at the screen here, there is a function we can use called len, which is short for length. And when you pass it a list name, it tells you how many rows are in that list. So let's make our code a little more robust.
Yes.
So it can handle lists of any size.
Yep.
And it'll still work. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio now, and I'm going to say number of values in my list equals whatever values returned by length guests. Because the length function will tell me how many values are in that list. And then in my for loop, instead of saying execute it 4 times, I say execute it however many values in list. And watch my casing there, make sure I got my uppercase all matching. And now, if I have 4 values, we're good. But if I go in and I add Sonal to the list, my code will still work. And that's making my code more robust so it can handle more situations, different sizes of lists. And really, it's also allowing me to be a lazy coder because I don't have to change it if somebody gives me a different list value back.
Yay, being a lazy coder.
Yes. All right, so we have now that ability to loop through all the values in a list. Now, if we go back to the slides, though, don't tell anyone, but there's actually a really, really easy way to go through all the items in a list. It's such a common thing we have to do in code. I mean, really, if you're working with lists, I can almost guarantee in your code, you're going to end up having code that says, now, for every value in the list, do this. It happens all the time. So they have a special loop, which is for every value in the list, do this.
Yep.
It's a for loop. Do you remember when in the for loops chapter, we're going to give you a flashback, we actually said for color in red, blue, black, green, and it was a special syntax where we could specify the exact values to use when we entered the list?
Yep.
And when we specified red, blue, black, green, we put them in square brackets with commas separating the values, which is exactly the same syntax we use to declare a list. That's not a coincidence. That is actually quite deliberate. So if we take a look at the slide, you can see when we declare a list of values, you can just say for, and guest, you can call, this is just like steps, color, or whatever you want to call it, right? Some variable name in this list.
Yep.
You could actually put for guest in open square bracket, Christopher, Susan, Bill, Satya.
Yep.
Or if you've got that set of values stored in a list, you can just say for guest in guests.
And what's actually been kind of cool is, again, watching the Q&A window, a lot of people were calling exactly that out. And one thing I would like to answer while we're here is that if you do this, so for guests, if we throw the code back up, if you say for guest in guests, and let's say as part of that loop, we added a brand new guest, and back to the end, it will actually pick that up as well. So if somewhere in there I said guest.add Sonal, and we're kind of doing that loop, Sonal would be picked up by that for loop, which is really neat. So if it is dynamic, if it is something where you're going to append on to the end, that for loop will pick that up.
So if you have logic where as you're going through the guest list, you're saying, oh, if this person, look them up here and see if they said they're bringing a friend.
Yeah.
And if they said they're bringing a friend, add the friend to the guest list.
Yep.
And then, so within your loop, you're actually adding new guests, which are the friends of your original invitees.
Yeah.
Then it'll actually look for friends of the friends.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is kind of freaky when you think about it. So let's look at that in the code and sort of see how that would work. So option 1 for looping through a list, that's what we were just looking at. So now I'm going to show you a second option for looping through a list using my Control KC to comment out my code again. Option 2 for looping through a list. And in this case, all I have to say is I like to sometimes do it this way. I sometimes call it current guest.
I do quite frequently because, again, it's one of those little things that just makes the code more readable. It's the current guest.
Yeah, and then I just say print current guest. And that in my brain helps me remember, so as it's going through the loop, the current guest is the one that's being looked at by the loop right now. So I just like that word current guest when I'm going through loops as a way of going through lists, sorry.
Yep.
So when I'm going through a list, in a loop, I like using the phrase current guest or current color because mentally when I'm reading my code, I say, well, print the current guest as I'm working my way through my list. All right, so we've got the code here. So let's try executing that and see what happens. Sure enough, still gives me back every single person in the list, no matter how many different values. But it's a very clean, very easy syntax. Like I said, you could specify the actual list value here. That's actually what we did a couple of chapters back. But you could just specify a list if it contains the values as well. All right.
And again, it's worth sort of mentioning here that you could absolutely have pulled that in dynamically. So again, if you had read that in from a file, from a database, from input, that how the list is generated is sort of irrelevant. The fact that you have the list is the important part. So you could do the for on that.
That's right. And when we get into files and we start reading from files, we're going to read values from files. We might just end up putting them in a list and doing something just like that. So you can see again how it all starts to fit together.
It's like we planned it that way.
Yeah. Another thing that's very useful, you know, it's funny, when I first took my first programming courses, one of the #1 assignments they gave you on programming courses was, here's a list, sort the values alphabetically. And then there were like 6 different ways to sort it. You could use a bubble sort, or you could use a something sort, and all of these different things. And
if you had 11:28 Pacific time for the first reference to bubble sort, please come forward and collect your prize.
Standard programming assignments, exactly. You were always told to sort a list. Well, guess what? If you're a professor, you're ever taking a course, and they give you a list in Python, and they ask you to sort the list, one line, thank you. All you do is call the sort method, and it will sort the names in alphabetical order.
And actually,
sort the values in alphabetical order.
There again in the Q&A. Can you sort?
Yes, there you go. So yes, you guys are thinking of exactly the right kind of problems. There is a sort method you can call. So you do not have to learn how to write bubble sorts. You can just call the sort method, and it will sort your records. So I'm not going to bother demoing that just because we're running a little bit long. But your challenge, should you choose to accept it, would be to try this out yourself, because you're going to get to try doing the sort in the challenge. You're going to ask a user to enter the names of everyone attending a party. So I'm going to have to use the input function. Then I have to return a list of the party guests in alphabetical order. This is actually going to require pulling together a little bit of everything we've seen. So if we take a look at the slides, when you get more complex problems, what I recommend is break it into steps. So what do we actually have to do? 1, we're going to have to ask the users to enter the names. 2, we're going to have to put those values in a list. 3, we're going to have to sort the list. And then 4, we're going to have to print out the list after it's sorted. And then you can think, well, I know you guys out there already know how to ask a user to enter values. That's going to be the input function. And what type of variable we need to store the variable? Because we have multiple names to store, we're going to need to create a list to hold the values. How do you ask a user for more than one name? Because I'm going to keep asking them for one name, after another name, after another name. So I'm going to need a loop. Should it be a for loop or a while loop? Well, do you know how many names are going to be entered? I don't know. So therefore, I can't go with a for loop. So I'm going to have to go with a while loop. How will the loop know when to stop executing? You're going to have to figure that out. Maybe the user enter a special keyword when they're done or something like that. But if the user has to enter a special keyword, you better tell them. That would be a good idea. Then the second thing you'll have to do in terms of steps is you'll have to take the values that are entered by the user, and you're going to have to store them in a list. So every time someone enters a new name, add it to your list. Then sort your list. We already saw we have a sort method to do that. And finally, you're going to need a loop that goes through the values in the list and prints out the values. So this one's going to be a little more complex. We're starting to pull together a lot of different things we've seen. We're also solving more complex problems. So it's going to be something along these lines. I am going to throw out a little problem for you that you're going to run into. If you write code like this, and I say, hey, guest, when you enter a name, we're done, I'll assume you've entered all your names. And in my code, they enter a value, and then I add it to the list. But I want to point out a little problem. When I print out the list of names invited to the party, I end up inviting Dunn.
Dunn, just whenever he shows up, he just makes a mess of the place. We never want Dunn at the party.
So this is the kind of little things you run into when you start solving problems. So if we go back to the slide, I'll give you a little hint. You might want an if statement as well. So wow, if statements, loops, inputs, prints, lists, we're putting everything together. So you're going to have some fun with this challenge, but I also know you can do it. And I think that takes us to the end of another module.
Yeah, that actually does it. So, lists are cool. But of course, the problem with lists is that it's just in memory for right then. What happens if we close the program?
Ah,
want
yes. If I want to remember that list for later, I might just need to save that information in a file.
Ooh.
Coming
We
soon.
should talk about that. We'll see you in 10. We'll talk
All right,
about that.
bye.